Good afternoon. My name is Álvaro Santos. I'm a professor at Georgetown University Law Center and the director of the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas. I will serve as moderator of this session on engaging the global economy, international law, trade, and investment. This is the second session of ASIL's series on international law and the 2020 presidential election, What is at Stake? I'm delighted to welcome you and to have the opportunity to talk to our two very distinguished speakers joining us today. Let me introduce them in alphabetical order. First, we have Kellyanne Shaw, who is a partner at Hogan Lovells in the International Trade and Government Relations Practice Groups. She spent the past 10 years in government in a variety of roles, including 6 years at the US Trade Representative, including 3 years in Geneva, litigating WTO trade disputes and negotiating new trade agreements, 2.5 years on the Hill as trade counsel for the Ways and Means Committee, and most recently she served as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. While at the White House, Kellyanne ran trade, investment, and international economic policy for both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. She served as the lead negotiator for the United States at the G7, G20, and APEC. She was also a key negotiator of the China Phase 1 deal and negotiations with the EU, UK, and others. In addition to Hogan Lovells, she is an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School and a senior advisor at CSIS. Welcome, Kellyanne. Great to have you with us. And next we have Catherine Tai. Catherine is Chief Trade Counsel and Trade Subcommittee Staff Director for the Committee on Ways and Means in the House of Representatives. She advised the committee's Democrats and the Democratic Caucus's working group in the 2019 renegotiation of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement with the Trump administration. Catherine came to the committee in 2014 from USTR's Office of the General Counsel, where she served as Chief Counsel for China Trade Enforcement, with responsibility for the development and litigation of US disputes against China at the World Trade Organization. Before joining USTR, Catherine worked in the international trade departments in several Washington, DC law firms. As you can see from our speakers' tremendous experience and knowledge, we're very fortunate to have the opportunity to hear their views and talk to them. So what I'm planning to do is ask a series of questions to stimulate discussions about what is at stake in the 2020 presidential elections for US trade and investment policy. And I'd like us to identify contrasts between a potential Trump or Biden administrations, but also possible commonalities. So to start with the first question about general direction, let me just say that the Trump administration seems to have broken with the global liberal consensus of the last 3 decades in a variety of issues. The administration withdrew from TPP, renegotiated NAFTA, it has adopted a challenging stance towards the WTO, it's engaged in a tariff war with China, and it's taken national security measures related to trade. So to kick off the discussion, and given this background, I'd like to start with Catherine, asking her what would be the overall vision and agenda for trade and investment of a Biden administration? What would it seek to accomplish? In what ways would it differ or continue the direction of the last 4 years?
Thank you so much, Alvaro, and thank you for having me. And it's wonderful to see Kellyanne. We go back quite a long way and have worked together quite a bit. To your question, I think if I'm going to go to the bottom line immediately, and to be very, very honest, my answer is I don't know, right? Because this is a speculative exercise. But that's what makes this entire discussion, I think, very interesting. I think Let me also start off with a disclaimer that for purposes of today's discussion, I'm speaking only for myself based on my personal views. Obviously, my personal views are informed by my day job, advising and working for the committee Democrats and the caucus on trade. Let me give you my best guess in terms of what a Biden administration would bring in terms of a vision for trade and investment. As a reader of policy papers and the discussion pieces that are being populated in the general public right now, if you look at the Biden plans, I think there are a couple of things that you can glean from those plans. The first one is that as you read through the plans, there's a very, very clear emphasis placing a priority on the American worker, on the building up of and prosperity for individual Americans and different American communities. So I think there's a very, very clear theme in terms of an inclusive prosperity that Biden is working toward. The other thing I would note is that if you're looking at the plans that the campaign has put out, there's one on Building Back Better. There's one on, I forget the precise title, but essentially making things in America and manufacturing, having Americans manufacture. And there's another one on supply chains. What I think is quite interesting about this is that there are trade implications in each of these plans, but you don't see a plan specifically dedicated to trade itself. And so what that tells me as well is that the Biden administration's posture on trade and investment policy is to approach it in a more holistic manner. So that's what I would expect, and I think that they're very promising ideas, and I would love a chance for all of us to see what a Biden administration would bring on trade.
Thank you, Catherine. Let me now turn to Kellyanne and ask this same question. What would a second Trump administration mean for the trade and investment agenda? Would we see continuity? And if so, how? Are there some potential plans for change, and in what areas?
Sure, and I also would like to start by thanking you for hosting this panel, and it is so great to be reunited, even virtually, with Catherine, who I've worked with for many years and am a huge fan and supporter of. So I'm glad we can be here discussing trade together. I have a similar disclaimer as Catherine in that I speak for myself. I don't work for the administration anymore, but my views on what a Trump term 2 would look like are certainly also informed by my experience in that administration and what I'm seeing coming out now in terms of public consumption. But when I was at the White House, we really did view trade policy through the prism of what is pro-jobs and pro-growth. And the president's pro-job and pro-growth platform consisted of a few component parts. So one was tax reform, the other was deregulation, the third was energy independence, and then this fourth piece was trade policy and really taking up ways to level the playing field. So, everything we did was viewed towards that end, like how does this create jobs? How does this create growth here at home? So there was more of a focus on the domestic market that we hadn't quite seen play out in previous administrations, at least not to this extent. There were a number of challenges we faced, and I think, ultimately the goal of policy is to fix a problem, to solve a problem, and to come up with a better way forward. So when you look at the board of what's at stake, there are things like China's unfair trade practices, which despite phase 1 still persist. We never did get to phase 2 or 3, and there are a number of challenges there with respect to state-directed economic activity. Another challenge is the rise of the digital economy, modern economic challenges that simply didn't exist when the rules of trade were crafted 20 years ago. The third is the breakdown of multilateralism. And I know we're talking about the WTO later, so we can get to that, but really this idea that a lot of the rules are stuck in the last century. And so what does that mean moving forward? And can we really address things among trading partners, or do countries need to go do it themselves? Another problem that we faced was the fact that 95% of the world's customers are outside the borders of the US. So to really engineer growth and jobs here at home, that also requires active export markets. And then, another challenge that we saw was the breakdown of democracy, which was playing out, or challenges to democracy playing out here at home in the US, but also we saw with Brexit in the UK, a number of problems arising in France, in Chile, and all throughout the world, where the general population really just felt divorced from the policies that were being made from policymakers. And I think USMCA is sort of the result of that, right? It's sort of a reorientation of responding to what constituents are looking for from their policymakers. And then now we're facing supply chain challenges, which were highlighted by COVID, and just the realization that in the midst of a crisis, we can't necessarily exclusively rely on our trading partners because they have a responsibility to their own constituents. We do need to manufacture some things here at home. And so I think whether you're looking at a Biden administration or a Trump 2, those are the types of challenges that need to be addressed. And we've seen this administration use things like tariffs for a number of means, not just with respect to the specific products, but also using it for leverage and to address national security concerns. We've seen a willingness and a desire to negotiate free trade agreements. We've seen the implementation of Buy American policies, an emphasis on labor standards, and related policies that I think we will continue to see play out. And then that's not even talking about the national security issues, which are not specific to trade, but certainly have significant trade implications.
Thank you. So I hear obviously many differences, but also certain commonalities that I'd like to start highlighting. And it seems like one important commonality here is the emphasis on workers, on jobs, and on prosperity. And so it'd be interesting to think about whether the positions have common ground in terms of what the actual policies would look like, or how they would differ. And I think perhaps something that could be helpful to that end is ask you about the USMCA. So this is the product of the NAFTA renegotiation, and it's an agreement that garnered a lot of bipartisan support, something that we hadn't seen in the United States, at least not for decades. And so do you see the USMCA as a new model, as a template for US trade policy and future trade agreements? And I'm particularly interested in the question of labor and investment, but feel free to add anything that you like there. But can we expect that this will be or could be what a potential Biden or Trump administration would continue? And so let me turn again to Catherine for this question.
Thank you, Alvaro. I think that's a really important question and a really good focal point for talking about trade as we're looking forward to the next couple of years. I would say this in terms of working on trade with the Democrats in the past 3.5 years, which is perhaps unique or different from colleagues of mine who work on other policy areas. There has been, in the past 3.5 years, a huge amount of growth and exercise that those of us who work on trade have been forced to do. And that is that the Trump administration has a brand of being rule and norm breaking, of being really in your face, confrontational, provocative. But on trade, I think that the number one takeaway that I have from the past 3.5 years is that the Trump administration has not been 100% wrong on trade. Trade policies and push in terms of the substance that we have really had to work through and think through, and that there has been opportunity for commonality of purpose between Democrats on the Hill and this administration. And I think that is actually quite unusual for the policy landscape over the past couple of years. So with respect to your question on whether or not USMCA serves as a model or as a template, the one thing I wanted to do is just say, I think I like your framing as a model better than as a template. I think that in the past in US trade policy, we have gotten very used to this idea of doing our free trade agreements by template. And over time, one of the problems that we have encountered is that with respect to these trade agreements and trade partnerships, one size does not fit all. And I think that in this moment where we have approved and entered USMCA into force, and there are 2 currently ongoing trade negotiations, what you see is how do you adapt what was accomplished in USMCA to new agreements that are being formed? One in discussions with the United Kingdom, one in discussions with Kenya, 2 very, very different countries, 2 very different economies with different contexts and with different opportunities presented. So that's a long way of as much as a model, but as a important block or foundation to build off of. And to your point about the really high levels of bipartisan, bicameral support for USMCA, for me, I think the biggest lesson from this exercise is that our trade policies and the trends in globalization over the past couple decades have hit, or let me put it this way, have come to a crossroads where there are serious questions being asked about the wisdom of the policies, whether these policies still serve the public interest. And what is most critical in my mind about USMCA is that it was the first attempt to revisit or reimagine how our trade policies, how our globalization policies can be modified and meet with more robust support, not just with the Congress, but the Congress as a proxy with the American people. So I think, it's not a one size fits all. You can't just take this and go stamp it in the UK and Kenya. But I think that, the right lesson to take from it is that our policies deserve a revisitation and some new ideas. And I don't know that all of the new ideas are going to work, but we really do need to try them.
Thank you. Kellyanne?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I very much think that at this point in time, it is difficult to tell the difference between Republicans and Democrats on a lot of trade issues. There are a number of similarities that didn't exist even 2 years ago. I mean, USMCA is an example of that, where I think when the whole exercise was originally embarked on, there was skepticism from the perspective of the Republicans that the administration would be able to get a number of Democrats on board to an FTA vote, because it just hadn't happened. And so the fact that Bob Lighthizer and the president were able to achieve that is really remarkable. But I think it's also, what happened was the need to address this challenge of democratic legitimacy. And some of our trade policies had simply lacked that. And that's why you had just an outcry by labor unions and blue collar workers in middle America to have their trade policies work for them. So I do think that there is now this expectation that a number of our trade agreements will address labor issues. It was a successful model. I think that, to the extent it can be applied to other markets, it will be. I absolutely agree with Catherine that, not all countries and not all economies are created equal. And when you are negotiating new trade agreements, you have to make certain accommodations to meet that. And certainly we have novel offensive and defensive interests when we are engaging with different countries too. So there are a lot of reasons to break from a quote template. So I agree, I like the word model. But on labor and investment, I think that we've sort of bent the curve and are charting a new path in terms of what the expectations are for trade agreements moving forward. But I would also throw a sort of a wrench into the conversation and highlight Ambassador Lighthizer's op-ed on the WTO, where he said something that was quite provocative to a number of people. And that was, we either need to embrace MFN and a single trading system and abandon the individual bilateral free trade agreement efforts, or we should revert to a system of bilateral agreements. So I think it's a fair question as to where a Trump 2 or Biden administration goes, because that it could have implications for what FTAs look like moving forward.
Thank you. And before we move to the WTO and this question that I'm happy that you raised, I just wanted to follow up on the USMCA question to get a little bit more focus on the details, and particularly on the investment front. So the Trump administration's position has been that the investor state dispute settlement system is encouraging outsourcing, that American companies go abroad and this serves as a kind of insurance for them if something goes wrong. And there's a lot of emphasis on trying to keep production in the United States, right? So there's this link between what the US policy has been up to now in terms of promoting bilateral investment treaties or investment chapters in trade agreements, and this retreat in some ways. USMCA shows it by first having no ISDS with Canada and then having a reduced form of investors' rights with Mexico, right? Do you think that, so maybe this is a question for Catherine first, but do you think that the Biden administration would continue with that policy? I mean, that's a clear break from Obama's administration TPP policy that's still carried with some modifications, but the full program of promoting investment chapters.
So this is a really meaty question, and thanks for letting me have a first go at it. I will let Kellyanne fill in the details in terms of the Trump administration's vision. Before I go there, I do have a follow up on Kellyanne's references to the accomplishment of USMCA by the president and Ambassador Lighthizer. I think that from our perspective, it was very much a joint effort, and that this is a baby, that was created. With bipartisan effort, and all credit to Ambassador Lighthizer for having the credibility with Democrats in particular in the House to have the trust to make something like that happen. But certainly there's a lot of ownership about that from our side too. Alvaro, to your question on investment and what we might see from a different administration, a Biden administration in the future, I guess a couple things. Now, you've taken as the starting point a revisitation of ISDS in USMCA. I might take it back a couple years further, back to TPP times and when there was an active TTIP negotiation going on. ISDS has been red hot, in some places radioactive, for quite a while now. I think there was a real moment when John Oliver dedicated most of an episode to the topic of ISDS. When I thought, wow, trade policy has really arrived. Now, that's before the Trump administration. I feel more relevant now than I certainly did in earlier phases of my career. But if you recall, during the negotiation of TTIP, there were massive demonstrations in Berlin, I believe it was, where hundreds of thousands of people, I think, came out. I think that that should be a reason for us to pause. The policy lessons we take away from it, I think will be important. I think it is worth looking at the logic that has driven how ISDS has landed in USMCA. Again, I'll let Kellyanne speak to that, but I may have additional thoughts to add. But let me take a slightly different tack, which is if you look at critiques of world trade rules and the rules in our FTAs, the FTAs and BITs are really where ISDS come into play. There has been an increasing discomfort with the outcomes from this liberalization and globalization program, which is to look at the balance between the interested stakeholders in our economies and a sense that the trade agreements that we have are between governments, but beneficiaries and cost bearers are outside of those governments, right? And you have workers who are an important piece of that puzzle. You have firms who are an important piece of that puzzle. I would argue that the environment is a piece of that puzzle as well. But if we look at firms in particular, there is a sense that multinational corporations have done very, very well under the current program. And that's fine, except that I think the increasing discomfort is that the multinational corporations have done so well and others have done not so well. In fact, there are others who have done and maybe been harmed by the programs. ISDS is an interesting element of the modern sort of free trade agreement that we've seen, in that not only in ISDS are firms not on the side of being held accountable, right? They are in a part of the agreement where firms are given extra private rights of action that no one else has. And so, you know, I think that with respect to ISDS, there are other ways of looking at it. There are other ways of trying to understand the discomfort around ISDS that are going to be very, very important to thinking about how these investor rights, you know, play out in new agreements, and how we think about investor and firm responsibilities as well.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think I didn't mean to suggest that this was the critique of ISDS was an innovation of the Trump administration. You're absolutely right that this was brewing before, and not only in TTIP and the demonstrations in Berlin, but a lot of opposition by civil society groups in the United States to TPP, including labor unions and environmental groups and consumer groups, right? And so there's a sense also in the developing world that these agreements are really making it harder for them to pass regulations for the public good, whether it's in health or in environment. And so this is a real concern. But we hadn't seen that adopted in US policy up until the Trump administration's position in USMCA. And so that's what I wanted to. And what I'm hearing from you, Catherine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm hearing, yes, this is a real concern of the Democrats as well, as was clear in the bipartisan agreement of USMCA. And we could expect that a Biden administration would continue on this path of making, balancing investors' rights in a better way with other stakeholders. That is not a return to the previous policy reflected in TPP, but in some ways, perhaps progress or moving forward with the new policy. Okay, great. Kellyanne, I don't know if you want to jump in here on the question of the continuation of investment on USMCA.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Trump administration has made their position on ISDS quite clear. So if there is a Trump 2 administration, I would expect a continuation of that policy. But, you know, just quickly to add that it's still quite controversial within the Republican side of the aisle. There are a number of benefits to investment protections and provisions, and I can see a scenario that you know, the discussion of supply chains and creating a North American supply chain and America's supply chain in contrast to a global supply chain, as we're dealing with pharmaceutical products, medical devices, and other critical goods and products, it could potentially benefit from strong investor protections for a region. So, you know, there may be some tension there as we continue to explore other policies in the broader trade agenda, but I don't expect at least this president to change his mind on ISDS in the next 4 years.
Great. So let me now move to the multilateral arena. Kellyanne, you mentioned a moment ago Ambassador Lighthizer op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and where he was basically talking about the U.S. position regarding the World Trade Organization. And so here, just to sum up for the audience, what we've seen is a position of the U.S. that has challenged the WTO and particularly the Appellate Body by basically not blocking the existence and the continuation of the appointments of Appellate Body members, so that effectively there's no Appellate Body at the moment. It'd be interesting here to hear. So Lighthizer had some proposals for how this could be reformed, and I think it would be very helpful if you could give us, Kellyanne, your view about what would be a potential Trump administration's position on multilateral trade. You said that what we were seeing was, in some ways, the cracking or some problems with multilateralism, but some people perceive that the Trump administration has played a very important and detrimental role in the functioning of multilateralism. And so what would be the agenda for multilateral trade and perhaps for reform of the WTO were Trump to win?
Sure, I think it's a great question, and I'd be interested in Catherine's views as well, because I assume this is more or less a bipartisan issue. It's a popular topic. I spoke on a panel earlier this week with a former colleague of ours, Nassim, during an off-the-record panel, and it was so interesting that a reporter actually quoted us, notwithstanding the fact that it was off the record, and wrote a story about it. So I've been fielding a number of questions about some off-the-cuff remarks I made earlier this week as well. The WTO is tough. It's tough to really prescribe an antidote for moving the institution forward. And I think what's interesting about Ambassador Lighthizer's op-ed, and what really surprised a lot of people, was his willingness to embrace multilateralism, in contrast to a number of messages from the Trump administration that seem to shun multilateralism and embrace unilateralism instead. So there seemed to be some surprise by folks that I talked to in the industry that he was so positive about the institution in a number of ways. But I've worked for 2 different administrations. I've worked for Congress. And I worked for this administration on WTO issues. And there's a lot of frustration because day by day, the institution is becoming more and more irrelevant. And that's not for lack of our desire to see it move forward. And I'm certainly a strong supporter of the system, but we really are stuck when it comes to negotiations. And so all of the attention in the last 2 years has been on what's wrong with the dispute settlement system and what the United States is doing to block appellate body judges. And all we need to do is resolve the appellate body crisis and the WTO will be saved. And I think the point is that it's almost beside the point, because the issues that we're seeing play out in dispute settlement, where member countries are using litigation instead of negotiation, are really just another symptom of the atrophy in the negotiating function. And unless there are new rules to address modern challenges negotiated among members, we're going to continue to see judicial overreach and extraneous interpretations, because they're taking old rules and having to try to interpret them for modern challenges. And then we as member countries are slapping their wrists and saying, don't do that. And they're looking at us like, you put us in an impossible situation. So, when you look at the challenges that we're facing that I laid out at the beginning of the program of state-directed economic activity and digital trade and national security issues and supply chain issues, the WTO just doesn't have rules to address it. And so I think what Ambassador Lighthizer did was start talking about some pretty bold and radical proposals for trying to unstick the negotiating function of the WTO, that either we as countries agree to one multilateral system where MFN is real, or we just have individual trade agreements with one another and effectively undermine the multilateral trading system in the process. So I think they're provocative questions that either Trump 2 or Biden will have to deal with, but the frustrations on the US side are bipartisan and longstanding. So I'm not really sure where we go. I think that Ambassador Lighthizer laid out a potential roadmap. I assume there'll be pushback and questions from other countries on it, but I do think it's a positive start to at least engaging in conversation on what's really wrong. And it's not the dispute settlement system, it's the negotiating function.
Well, now, of course, I want to hear Catherine's views on this question and what would be a position of the potential Biden administration on multilateralism, particularly how it approached the WTO?
I mean, I think, I want to revisit something I said a little bit earlier in terms of Democrats have found common ground with this administration on trade. What I would also say is that I don't think that there's many Democrats, I haven't met a single Democrat, but that's not to say that there might not be some out there who would have done things the same way that the Trump administration has. That said, with respect to the WTO, and this is the point that I want to make, if you look at the substance of the concerns and issues that this administration has been raising in Geneva and here at home, I think that you find very little difference in the substance from the kinds of concerns and interests that previous administrations from both parties have made. And so this is one of those issues where I really, it hasn't been a partisan issue, and I really hope that it doesn't become a partisan issue. The WTO is a great idea. It has done really important things, and I would argue that the WTO has been very effective in accomplishing a number of things. I would say that it is now 25 years old. And to Kellyanne's point, the world is quite different now than it was 25 years ago. We just went through this whole exercise with USMCA, where there were supporters of the renegotiation of NAFTA because of just the passage of time and the need for modernization. But there also was, importantly, an element of revisitation and course correction. In the spirit of being a little bit provocative for purposes of this audience, I would posit that NAFTA and the WTO agreements are from the same era of our economic history, our global economic history. In addition to digitalization of our economy, of changes in technology and the way that we communicate with each other and the way that we transact commerce, the one incredibly important development has been the economic growth and rise of China in the global economy. And that too, so far, has not been a partisan issue. 2020 is really giving everybody a run for the money in terms of dynamics around China and China trade. But this is an issue where I really hope that it doesn't become partisan, because it really is so important, not just for the United States, but for our global economic community in terms of dealing with the ways in which the WTO has disappointed expectations, or the ways in which the WTO has not been effective over the course of the past 25 years.
Okay, thank you. So let me wear my academic hat here, because you're both speaking from a perspective of the US, and I want to perhaps pose a challenge, which is that it seemed like the WTO was working very well as long as the US was coming ahead, and the US has incredible, legal talent. You're an example of that. And so it's done well in many of its cases. It was litigating strategically. But as emerging economies have become part of the system and have learned how to do that, the US has become more disgruntled or less happy with some of the decisions when they're not favoring them. And one could say this is what happens with any legal system and with any appellate court. Why should we now step in for a moment outside exclusive US interest? If we're thinking about multilateralism, this has to appeal to the world, not just the United States. Why would the rest of the world agree to this position? This is a system where countries win and lose. Sometimes the decisions might be disappointing, but that's the system that the US was a leader, a pioneer in creating. And so I want to see if we can reflect a little bit more on, if we're really talking about multilateralism, how can we make this work in a way that is not just basically, well, when the US loses, we don't like multilateralism, but rather thinking about it from the point of view of on a global perspective. And so let me just go with you, Kellyanne, first.
Sure. Who's first? No, it's a great question. And I know personally that the administration and Congress are fully aware that our trading partners need to be on board. But, it also needs to work for the US, right? We are the most active litigant on the offense and defense. And a number of our concerns have to do with cases where we actually won. I mean, if you walk down the halls of USTR, OGC, and you saw the reactions of lawyers as they're reading these appellate body reports on provisions where we may have won the claim, but we feel like systemically the system has lost credibility. And that happened a number of times. These are not new concerns because other countries are now participating or because we've lost a certain case. I mean, we have interest on both sides. DSU review, which was actually the long-standing negotiation to try to resolve some of these dispute settlement issues, has been ongoing since 2001. I was in Geneva for 3 years, tabling proposals, trying to build coalitions with other members, talking about the 90-day rule, talking about domestic law as an issue of fact or law, and all of the issues that we're continuing to discuss were just as active in 2011 when I was there. Hours of my life I will frankly never get back because countries' positions have just become further entrenched. And so, I think I take issue with your premise that this is about us losing cases, because what it's really about is the credibility of the system and the legitimacy of the system. And my talking point back then to other countries was, if the system goes too far, it's going to be Congress that is upset that they're having to change a law because of an adverse decision of an appellate body that exceeded all of its procedural rules and engaged in judicial interpretation. So the wrench in it was the administration became more tough on these issues than Congress did, but I think they're pretty lockstep in terms of the concerns. So I agree with you, there is no system that can work in the WTO unless everybody agrees, but we also need a meeting of the minds to have that.
So that's great, Kellyanne. Let me just follow up on this point. So if you have a system of an appellate review, and this happens domestically as well, when courts make decisions, they are interpreting texts that are often vague, ambiguous, they have gaps, and so when they make decisions, the parties who lose or don't like those decisions often accuse them of being activists or of making law rather than interpreting, right? Or making just judicial decision making. What would be then the role of a tribunal at the international level? But because what some of the criticisms we're seeing leveled against the WTO are also leveled domestically here in the United States, right? It's the perennial question of what's the role of a court or of the judicial body. And so how would you address those questions? Isn't any court in some ways put in a position where it has to interpret text that the parties couldn't further work in absolute detail, precisely because they couldn't foresee all the possible ramifications?
Just for me still?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And if you talk to any of the negotiators of the WTO agreements, they will tell you that some of the text was unclear, that there was constructive ambiguity, that there are gaps. I mean, the WTO text also never underwent a legal scrub. So what negotiators in one room were negotiating wasn't necessarily well coordinated with negotiators in the other. So they may have used different language to describe the same thing. So, all sympathy to panelists and appellate body members for having to undergo this interpretive exercise, but where there are gaps and where there is, a lack of clarity, they can say that. But also the idea that, we see adjudicators writing 20 pages of dicta on matters that were settled on claims, few steps before, really does pose questions as to the legitimacy of that decision. And so there are a number of issues that we have seen systemically, again, being on both sides. Sometimes it works out better for the United States and sometimes it works out worse, where we tried to resolve it through tabling a number of proposals throughout the entire DSU review negotiations, but there wasn't really any engagement by other members on it. And that was part of the problem. So I think now members really do have important questions to ask about what kind of system they want. There's nothing religious or sacrosanct about an appellate step. I mean, you can certainly have effective dispute settlement and enforcement with, court of first instance and just stopping there, which we see in a number of other trading relationships and agreements. Or you can have an appellate function, but one that works more effectively. And so, it will be up to members, not just the United States, but collectively to decide that. But first, we have to acknowledge the problems and be on the same page about that.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm conscious of time. So Catherine, if you want to add something here, I would welcome that. But if not, I'll ask a new question.
You could get me going on the WTO for hours, but in the interest of time as well, feel free to move on to another topic if you like.
Perfect. Excellent. So the next question I'd like to raise here is a central one of the US-China trade relationship. And so what would be the goal of a potential Biden administration regarding this relationship, and how would it seek to accomplish it? And then we'll see. So I'll ask you first, Catherine, and then we'll go to Kellyanne.
So I think it's this is not a controversial statement, but that China's growth and development in recent decades has presented new challenges, a new dynamic around the world that we are all orienting to. I think that given our experience that Kellyanne referenced at the WTO with China, and overall in terms of thinking through, for instance, the debate and discussion in Congress when China PNTR came up in 2000 and 2001, normalizing permanently relations with China as part of China's accession to the WTO. I think that there was a lot of hope and expectation that the reforms that the Chinese leadership at the time were willing to undertake was a signal that China would not only be joining the WTO, but would over time also become part of the community of the norms, the economic norms, and maybe even and hopefully even the political norms that a lot of the WTO membership had in common. What we've seen over the course of the past 25 years in the WTO, and that China has actually been a member for just shy of 20 years, is different from what people had expected. Now, has China experienced enormous economic development and growth? Yes. But what has been the implications of that growth, and what are the impacts on our economic system and our growth? That I think runs into a lot of disappointments of expectations that our members of Congress, for instance, had 20 years ago. There were obviously a lot of naysayers at the time who would tell you now, that folks were naive to expect something different from China. But I think what I would say about where we are with China now and where we have to go next is we do have to recognize with very clear eyes the nature of the China challenge. And to the extent that China poses risk and threat to the way that we operate, to the way that we compete, to the way that our ideals in terms of the way we live our lives and the way we operate our society and our economy, those are things that we need to be very, very attentive to. What I would say in terms of what a Biden administration will hopefully do is come in and really crystallize the questions that we are asking, which is what is the nature of the Chinese challenge and the threat, and then have that lead us to a conversation around what are the measures then that need to be taken to manage the risk and the threat. I think that without that clear process in place, part of what makes me nervous about the China dynamics that we're experiencing in 2020 is that reactions become highly emotional, highly political, and risk becoming either ineffective at addressing the risk or threat, which is bad. But even worse, the threat is that the actions and the measures that we take are not just ineffective, but are actually actively harmful to the goals that we have. So that's one piece of it, which is to ask the right questions that will lead to the right kinds of measures. The second piece I would say is build a partnership with Congress. Again, this should not be a partisan issue, and in the past it has not been a partisan issue. And the third piece is that then, take effective action. Do what you need to defend against anti-competitive practices, but then also do what you need to both here and with others who should share your interests to take the active affirmative measures to make yourself stronger to withstand the competition.
Thank you. So if you don't mind, let me press you a little bit to try to see if you see there is a difference. And I really like the way you lay out the different steps that administration would need to follow to engage with China. So in the case of the Trump administration, it's done its diagnosis. It's decided that China represents a threat, that it's a threat for the model of the Chinese economy in several respects in the way it translates to trade competition. It's affecting certain US industries, and so it's taken effective action in the way of raising tariffs, for example, or using mechanisms to try to block those imports. Is that something that you think a Biden administration would continue, or would it do it in a different way because its diagnosis is perhaps different and the kind of instruments or tools that you'd like to use would also differ?
On this, I think I would like to make this observation, which is we have in the past in the US had a tendency to conduct our trade policy in a silo. That trade policies have been disconnected from other policies. Now, not entirely disconnected. I know that there have been critiques that our trade policies have been driven too much by foreign policy considerations. The origin story for USTR, the Office of the US Trade Representative, is that it was taken out of the State Department to ensure that trade policy would be driven more by economic interests and less be an appendage of the foreign policy establishment. So I will acknowledge that. But I think that one of the things that we've seen, and this is with respect to China, and also I think more across the board as well in the past 3.5 years of the Trump administration, is that this administration came into power with a very, very strong mandate that it perceived that it had on trade. And that mandate primarily was to rebalance trade relationships. You see that play out with respect to China and with respect to Mexico and NAFTA. That's just my observation. But one of the things that we've seen is that in taking measures to rebalance those relationships, this administration has continued this kind of siloed approach in activating trade tools only to address or correct for these imbalances and these dynamics in trade that have been criticized over time. I think that my concern is that, and my hope is that in the next administration, what you have is a much better coordinated policy between trade and international economic policies and domestic economic policies. Now, that doesn't mean that you just take the template of, sort of the past trade trajectory and then, hook it into other things. I think it means that you have to take a holistic view to what you are trying to accomplish, and that trade doesn't exist in its own silo. So bringing it back to your question on China, what I would say is this administration has effectively built a wall, a tariff wall, in the name of China trade enforcement. That's a fact, right? Whether it's a term 2 for the Trump administration or a new Biden administration, the next couple of years are going to have to deal with the landscape that has been created over this time. I think that my main point is that if we perceive that there are national security concerns in the way that we relate to China economically, if we perceive that there are competitive concerns, if there are concerns with respect to our ability to maintain our leadership in the innovation economy, if there are concerns around what happens to US user data, all of this needs to be taken together, but put through a very rigorous intellectual process so that what we are doing makes sense. Because I think that what is at stake, and this goes to the title for this discussion, is what is at stake is the ability of the US to maintain its leadership position in the global economy. And that leadership position has to be earned. And that, I think what will be critical is to harness what I know is a very deep bench, and what I hope will be a bipartisan bench in bringing really strategic thought to how we manage our relationship and our competition with China.
Thank you. Kellyanne, let me turn to you. You had mentioned you were involved in the phase 1 of the US-China agreement, but that you thought that was not enough. And I wonder if you can share your views about what would be next in a potential Trump 2 administration in terms of its engagement with China.
Yeah. Sure. And the reason I said it's not enough is because it didn't address all of the issues that had been identified in the 301, nor was it designed to, right? It was a confidence building step so that both sides could continue to build on that moving forward. But, China is a difficult challenge. There is a world pre-March and a world post-March. And we've seen a real about face from the American political landscape as to what to do about China since COVID came here. There are really 3 goals with our China relationship. The first is what the president started with, which is leveling the playing field and wanting to ensure that if our companies are doing business in China, that they do so on fair terms, that they're not subject to forced technology transfer, that they're not getting their intellectual property stolen, that effectively China is playing by the rules and playing fair. But the goal ultimately was for the US companies to continue to be able to do business in China. The second goal, somewhat analogously, but also contrastingly, is to bring jobs back to the US. And that's this concept that too much of our economy has gone over to China, whether it's because they've cheated or there are other incentives or whatever, but we need to bring more of that manufacturing back here. And then the third goal is the national security goal. We need to protect US national security interests no matter what. And so you have these 3 goals, which I tend to view as, a Venn diagram of circles, that sometimes the policies overlap and sometimes they pull in different directions. But since COVID, you actually have a lot more activity happening on the Hill and happening in Congress, where I think there has been this awakening of the dangers of a lack of transparency in a large economic system. Not only does it damage our commercial interests and our economic interests, but it actually has real implications for costs in human life. So there are a number of proposals ranging from everything from, CFIUS restrictions in media to delisting to bringing back manufacturing and pharmaceuticals that we see playing playing out there. And so really everyone seems to be rowing in the same direction on China. So for that reason, I'm not clear that we're going to see much of a distinction between a Biden administration or Trump phase 2, because I think that we as a country have crossed a line that we're really not going to come back from. Now, that said, there is a range in terms of what our ultimate relationship with China looks like moving forward, whether that's, we go towards decoupling or we maintain a more cohesive economic relationship, barring some national security concerns. And I think that all that has yet to play out. But the goals are now more aligned for both parties. So, the policies, we'll see where we go. A lot of it has to do with how China reacts as well. I don't see a lot of fertile ground for phase 2 anytime in the near future. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot of activity in the national security space playing out. But I also don't think there's incentive on either side to rip up phase 1. I don't think that's in the US interest, and I don't think it's on China's interest, which is why that agreement is remaining intact. But both sides have a lot of thinking to do in terms of the way forward, and we'll see where we get to. But I agree with Catherine that this is going to play out over the next few years, and it's a interesting relationship and an interesting dynamic.
Thank you. You wanted to jump in, Catherine?
Alvaro, can I just do one follow-up? And it's a bit unfair of me because I know it's an area where Kellyanne can't go. I think that there is a tremendous amount of energy and policy energy around the US-China relationship right now. I think a really critical piece to this, and I feel I have more confidence in a Biden administration than what might happen in a continued Trump administration, which is that I really do think it is important for this China policy to be driven by policy and to be driven by US national interest rather than by politics. And this is where I'm going to take my advantage because I know Kellyanne can't go here. I would say this: I don't exclude the possibility that there are national security implications and concerns with respect to TikTok and WeChat. But I feel quite confident that if what we are trying to deal with are national security implications of our trade relationship with China, that those would not be the number 1 and number 2 executive orders that we would start with in addressing that relationship and addressing that risk. So that goes back to my initial point about trying to keep the bipartisanship around the approach to China and really focusing on the strategy, short, medium, and long term.
I want to move on, but Kellyanne, I want to give you a chance to respond if you'd like to.
I'm good.
We're almost out of time, sadly, for me, because I'm really enjoying this conversation. But I want to ask you about the link between trade and domestic distributional mechanisms. I think we're seeing now also with COVID-19 and all this emphasis on essential workers, that a big chunk of the workforce in the United States has very precarious jobs, what we often call gig workers, many of them without health insurance or good wages. And that's been an issue, I think, that is now the center of attention for both parties. I think that this concern about job quality, job losses, growing inequality has also changed the perspective about trade. And so in the United States, we have the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, but it's been, I think, perceived and criticized as very limited in its effects, right? So if we want to build support for trade and a robust trade agenda, we will need to do something domestically to make sure we help out people who lose from trade competition. And there I wanted to ask you about what you think would be the Trump 2 administration's program to ensure that, or the Biden administration to ensure that. And I'll give you a very small example that was really that really stood out for me, and I want to see. You don't have to address it, but it's an example of what I think is sometimes the problem of the connection between trade policy and domestic labor and domestic reform. In the USMCA, in the labor section of the USMCA, there's an annex that basically where Mexico committed to do an overhaul of its domestic labor law and domestic labor institutions. I think this would be very beneficial for Mexico for many reasons, right? But we saw nothing on the US side. That is, no reform of US labor laws or labor institutions there, even though for decades now, there's been tons of criticisms about how difficult it is for US workers to organize, to bargain collectively. There's new calls from many circles, again, both Democrats, Republicans, independent analysts, to reinvigorate collective bargaining in the United States, to do something about worker rights. And so what would be an agenda that could really be linking this trade policy to domestic change in the US? So let me see, let's go with Catherine first.
Thank you, Alvaro. That's another critical question. I actually have a lot of hope here for the Biden administration. I would say in looking at the plans, I really like the Build Back Better plan. And part of the reason is it takes into account the economic dysfunction and the economic recession really that we're in right now. It takes into account that COVID-19 is having an impact on our economy, and that there will need to be a rebuild from what happens. Now, I think that the landscape is quite complicated. We don't know what it will look like. I know people have talked about a V-shaped recovery, path to recovery, U-shaped, a K-shaped. I still can't quite visualize how the K-shape makes sense, but I do understand what the point is in terms of the K-shaped recovery. But I think you're right, and I guess once again I'd like to come back to the theme of not thinking about trade in a silo. I think that not only for the United States, but I think for the world economy, right? There's going to need to be a rebuild from a very serious public health crisis that we've been in that has had very serious economic implications. And I think that this presents an opportunity, and I think that you do hear this very clearly from the Biden administration, which is what you do is that you need to build back, but you need to build back better. And that there is a real focus on workers, on empowering workers, on workers and inclusive prosperity through this program. And what I would say also is in my own thinking about this is to go back again about 12 years to the start of the Obama administration, where the US economy and the global economy similarly had gone through a quite traumatic period, and there was a need to build back. And I think that what was quite successful in the years that followed was a resumption of prosperity, that GDP levels, that these economic metrics recovered, and that you had further growth. But, and I think that this is a really important issue that explains quite a bit of what we've been through since then, the prosperity that was created in the Build Back was concentrated in parts of our economy, and that there were significant parts of our economy, including regular people, people mid-career, people at the starts of their career, at the ends of their career, who over the course of that Build Back didn't ever feel like they re-achieved the levels of prosperity or the hopes that they had prior to that crisis. And so to your point, and this is taking a slightly bigger picture view beyond trade and trade adjustment assistance, I think that it is going to be critical, and I feel very confident that this is at the focus of the Biden campaign's thinking, based on what I'm reading from the campaign, that it is going to be and require a whole holistic policy approach to building back, and that trade has a job in all of this, but that the other policy areas, economic policies, need to be seriously revamped and built out in order to accomplish what needs to be accomplished.
Thank you, Kellyanne.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Catherine that, you know, there's only so much that a trade agreement can do, or frankly should do, right? I think that trade agreements get blamed for a lot and get credit for very little in terms of what they actually do for a domestic economy. But, you know, the point of trade agreements in the US is to improve the competitive conditions abroad and to level the playing field. And you don't often see in US trade agreements significant modifications or amendments to domestic issues. I mean, Congress is fully capable of passing its own law to resolve domestic policy. What we're trying to do is ensure that there's not a competitive advantage in Mexico, or name any other trading partner country where they don't have the same labor standards as the US, and that gives them an unfair competitive advantage. But, you know, labor issues here are domestic issues, and I think the Trump administration has focused on them to an extent that previous administrations have not. When you look at worker retraining and the jobs programs, and an emphasis on manufacturing and policies aimed at the steel and aluminum sector, and really trying to give the blue-collar worker and middle-class America prominence in the economic policy space. And so I think you'll see a continued emphasis on that, a desire to work with labor unions, and see that reflected in the international policies that come back as well, particularly trade deals. And as we talked about earlier, USMCA potentially being a model for that in other markets.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to